WholeCEO with Lisa G. I'm the best-selling author of The Boss Weight Loss. I'm bringing you the top tips to be unstoppable. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually pull up a chair with today's top experts in weight loss, mindset, and business. Learn our top tips to set you up for success so that you can have more energy, be fit and resilient, and feel unstoppable. Hello, everybody. We're here with Dr. Austin and David Perlmutter.
Hi, everyone. Hey.
Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist, 5 times New York Times bestselling author, serves on the board of directors, and is a fellow at the American College of Nutrition. He received his MD from the University of Miami School of Medicine, where he was awarded the Leonard G. Roundtree Research Award. Austin, you guys wrote this book together, right?
That's right.
I'm so excited. And I know that we are all making poor choices. Our decision making is a reflection of how our brains are wired. To consistently make good choices, we need a brain that is optimized for reflection, balanced thinking, and long-term outcomes. So do you want to speak to a little bit about the insanity that we're all living in right now?
Sure. Let me just take a step back and just let your viewers know that where Austin comes to this, the perspective, having completed his internal medicine training, being an MD now, boarded internal medicine. We were actually in this very room kicking around that question that you just asked about how important our decision making is. I mean, he was watching some decisions. Well, maybe you should talk about it. My goodness.
Sure. You mentioned this insanity, which is our reality right now. And it's so important to recognize that things don't have to be this way, that we're suffering from these catastrophic rates of preventable conditions. And these are things like heart disease, diabetes, like Alzheimer's, dementia, and even to a large extent, diseases like depression. These are preventable conditions. We know what it is that leads to these conditions. But so what, right? We know the solutions to losing weight is probably to eat less junk food. So what? We know it's good to exercise. It doesn't matter unless we actually follow through on making those necessary changes. So it's wonderful to know that eating cake isn't good for your health, but if you're still eating cake, that's actually a major problem for you, because now you're going to feel even worse when you do it. And so what my dad and I are talking about here is that it's not enough to know the information. It's not enough to rely on willpower. We need a new approach. We need a way of approaching these problems in our lives that doesn't require us to blame ourselves when things go wrong. And what we talk about in Brainwash is the way to start making these long-term solutions reality is by wiring your brain for better choices. That is the foundation of this book, and it's a message that we believe is essential for people to understand.
Like Austin said, Lisa, we don't suffer today from a lack of information. I mean, you're putting out great information. We know what we should be doing. We know what's good food and what's bad food. We know it's not good for us to stay up late on the computer or binge watching TV. We know we should get a little exercise, all these things, but how many people follow through? These are the recommendations that people get that will help stave off these diseases and reduce your risk for depression, Alzheimer's, coronary disease, diabetes, cancer, you name it. But yet these situations are rampant. And I think it's really very good, as per what Austin just said, that we include mental disorders in our discussion now, as we recognize that depression really very much is a consequence to a significant degree of this process of inflammation that underpins these other conditions. So it raises the idea that we could really experience a dramatic reduction in things like depression and anxiety when we begin to recognize how so many of the experiences of our modern lives are absolutely threatening to rewire our brains away from good decision making.
Well, thank you for that point. I would love to start with that because I know that willpower doesn't show up every day. So even though on the one hand, you're saying there's this knowledge of that we should eat better, we should get more sleep, we should exercise, what is the solution that you guys would offer to help rewire our brain so we can feel less anxious and have less inflammation and all of that?
To your excellent question, there are two major pieces that people should understand. The first part is to understand how your brain is being wired by other people, by the modern world, to your disadvantage. What are things like chronic stress and overexposure to digital media and the us versus them mentality doing to your brain? What happens to your brain when you're watching several hours of sensationalized news? This is literally wiring your brain for poor choices, and it's going to make it harder for you to get the things in life that you care about, like happiness, like health. And then the second piece of this is understanding what you can then do to start taking control of your brain wiring by incorporating things like nature exposure into your life, by incorporating things like relationship building into your life that then give you the opportunity to wire your brain for good choices, to make it so that you're not constantly fighting your brain to try to eat healthier or exercise, but such that you're both on the same team and getting towards those outcomes, good health and sustainable wellness. That is really what we want to be doing.
And I want to tell you, we've written our book, we've done a lot of media, but even just hearing what Austin just said just now, he said it before, let's be clear. It still is so impactful for me to hear those words when you think about the fact that endlessly watching the news stream or being online and being targeted by pop-ups and clickbait and other things that distract us, and recognizing on the front end what in the heck is going on, and then connecting that to ultimately being unhappy and unhealthy. That's step one. That's the first part of the book, is calling it out.
I love that, because I know that I know better, but I think, are you saying then boundaries on when you should have social media would be helpful, in addition to getting out in nature and walking, which I love?
Yes, exactly. And again, part one, understanding what your social media experience is doing to your brain wiring. It is locking you into one point of view, because generally where people go is to places where like-minded individuals reside. And that said, you're never going to be able to look at other people's points of view, because you're only looking at sort of a monotonous inflow of similar ideology.
Exactly.
So we're not saying social media is in and of itself a bad thing. It's where we go and how much time we spend. We wrote our book with the access to the internet, which was an unlimited resource of wonderful information. We are communicating with you right now, doing this podcast, by the grace of this incredible technology. It's not the technology that is the issue here. It's how we use it, or more importantly, how it uses us.
Yeah. I think to that end, I would say that there aren't these black and white, good and bad aspects of something like social media or screen time. What happens, though, is we get these channels that form where we get kind of progressively deeper into these trenches of how we interact with social media. And so we initially go on there to check on how our cousin is doing, and then we kind of get shuttled into these different thought patterns of, oh, well, this is my political party, and let's all be to experience vitriol against the other political party. Or just ideologies in general. And so when we get stuck in these channels, and those can also be outside of social media with, let's say, watching the news and experiencing stress and spending more time in these places that induce our brains to be stressed out, to be impulsive, to be aggressive towards other people, it's really hard for us to break out of that.
And I don't want to sound, like a conspiracy theory when we talk about how we are being manipulated. Our attention is being manipulated online. But we all know that this is true. We know that Facebook, for example, is well aware of what part of a menstrual cycle a woman is in when they target her with specific advertisement. We know that Facebook, for example, knows the level of anxiety of a teenage boy while he is online and targets him specifically. And these are just a couple of subgroups. Various demographics, across the board are targeted based upon how they will then respond. And that's good for other people. That isn't good for us. So we're going to light the single candle here and not curse the darkness too much. We curse it a little bit because it's got to be brought out. But having said that, we created what's called the test of time as it relates to being online. and that is T. How much time are you dedicating to the task?
I love it. So
Is
there's a test of time.
You
That's
bet. You bet.
actionable. That's great.
So T is how much time I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes looking at the website from my high school graduation class. Great. That doesn't mean responding to every clickbait to do a certain thing. Next thing you know, you're buying a Toyota. I, is it intentional? What do I hope to accomplish? Am I mindful while I am having my digital experience? Am I staying on top of the game, trying to recognize when things are trying to take me off task? And finally, E, is it empowering? Is it positive? Am I feeling when it's all said and done, I feel like I went somewhere that's good for me, as opposed to saying, God, I just pissed away 2.5 hours and it didn't do anything good for me.
Well, those are so relevant and timely topics right now, with people not even realize the anxiety and depression that is coming on with all of this, like social media exposure. And I even see with the younger generation of teenagers too, with the amount of screen time that they have in games, how anxious and depressed they are. And I know your expertise is also about nutrition. So in addition to like getting outside, limiting our screen time, and making sure it's empowering us instead of making us more anxious and depressed. And what other nutritional advice can you give us to just make us feel more unstoppable in our lives?
Well, I would say that with all due respect, I don't want to gloss over the preamble to your question, and that is the value of getting outside. We'll get to the nutrition stuff, but I think, most of your listeners have heard a lot of nutritional information. This week it's keto, next week it's paleo, and, things come and go in terms of being trends. But, the notion of nature connection, I mean, Austin contributed, why don't you, address it? You contributed so much to the book on that.
Yeah, this is a hugely undervalued aspect of our lives, is that we're getting these anti-inflammatory benefits, these immune boosting benefits, these anti-stress benefits from just being outside, from being around nature, even if that nature is honestly in your house, even if it's a photograph of nature, that's enough. So it's something that, again, it's been very undervalued, and something that is free. You can go outside, you can be around trees. In Florida, for us, it's maybe some palm trees, but going out to the beach and having that experience of awe when you're seeing this massive landscape. So these are the things we recommend in the book.
And how much time do you have to spend on a minimum to really get those benefits?
It looks like the data is still coming out, but it looks like right now around 20 minutes, even in an urban setting, is sufficient to start getting some of the anti-stress benefit at least.
Thank you.
I wanted to say another thing to your point about kind of the way the modern world is set up and people experiencing these high levels of depression, anxiety. And that is, I'm reminded of this story of the fish who runs into the other fish and asks him about the water, and the other fish goes, "What's water?" And it's when you're in it, when the default state is so stressful, so anxiety rich and so unhealthy, we don't recognize that things could be so much better. And the default state for so many of us is chronic stress, is a baseline anxiety, is to some level depression. Not necessarily the diagnosed criteria for depression, but depressive symptoms.
Well said.
And so again, we're living in chronic stress. That's where we start out. And so it's so strange to think about what it would be like if that was lower. And when it comes to food, it's the exact same thing. Our default diet is terrible. It is so unhealthy. And that's a point we make in the book is, what are health food stores? What is health food in the store when you see that aisle? I mean, that has become something that has to be differentiated because the baseline state, the default state, is junk. So recognizing that, and that's where we're starting from, should give listeners a feeling that, hey, I should be empowered to recognize that if I don't do anything differently, I'm not going to do well. That's how most people are doing, is poorly, whether that's stress, anxiety, depression, or obesity, chronic diseases. And we really want them to feel like this is the time to make that break, to say, I'm willing to take back my life, my wellness, and reject the status quo as it relates to mental health, as it relates to our chronic health conditions like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, heart disease. It doesn't have to be that way, but you've got to have the awareness that there is another way.
And, we describe in the book something called disconnection syndrome. And it means, quite literally, being disconnected from the adult in the room, from the getting back to our beginning of our conversation, the ability to make thoughtful, good decisions, thinking about the future, for example, thinking about how my decisions are going to be good, not only for me, but for others around me, and even for my future self. There are really a couple areas of the brain, if we can get a little bit more technical, that we talk about. One is the prefrontal cortex, maybe the adult in the room, and the other is an area called the amygdala that does play a role in more impulsive decision-making, more self-centered, narcissistic behavior and activities. And the disconnection that we talk about is when that prefrontal cortex is disconnected from this impulsivity center and not able to rein it in. So we don't have the control over that. And that connection, which we so depend upon, is threatened by this process of inflammation. So when Austin's talking about how getting out in nature helps reduce inflammation, that might well be the reason, or one of the reasons, or mechanisms that getting out in nature is associated with better decision making, less impulsivity, that then allows you to move forward and make better and better decisions as this all progresses. That's later in the book. Now another on-ramp is getting a good night's sleep. Same thing, helps to foster better decision making. The next night you'll pay attention to your sleep hygiene. It'll help you with your food decisions, help you to say, well, today I'm going to get 15 minutes out in nature, or exercise, or meditate for 12 minutes, or whatever it may be. So wherever we can finally break the code and get into better decision making, that will foster moving forward even better decision making. Now, I want to respond to the food question, which you posed to me an hour and a half ago. We got sidetracked, but that's okay. Food plays a very huge role, and as your viewers are well aware, food is important in terms of this mechanism of inflammation. It's the reason, for example, that food choices relate to risk for certain issues like diabetes, for example. It's via high sugar, highly processed foods, their role in raising blood sugar, and as such raising inflammation chemicals that reside in the body. Well, what we've discovered, and what we really spend a lot of time working through in the new book, Brainwash, is how inflammation threatens to worsen disconnection syndrome, keeping us away from making better decisions, making decisions that can keep us happier, that can keep us more socially engaged in the real world, not online, that can allow us to make decisions that think about tomorrow and the next day and a year from now, and decisions that benefit more than just me, that benefit people around me and people who may not be directly around me, but may live in another country, and even decisions that might benefit the planet itself. So we certainly embrace the idea that this modern Western diet is very inflammatory. This diet that favors highly processed foods with added sweeteners is really fanning the flames of inflammation. And when you recognize that inflammation fosters our disconnection, and that this modern Western diet is becoming the global norm, it means that the spread of our Western diet around the globe is threatening to disconnect people on the planet. So what we are calling attention to is this notion that even the dietary shift of humanity is threatening to make us more isolated, more fearful, more tribal, more self-centered, and less able to make thoughtful decisions than ever before. So it really becomes a very important discussion.
Well, you guys mentioned a couple things I want to finish with, because I know you're such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so grateful to have you guys on here. And it's so timely with all the political strife and all the amount of time on social media that we have this information. And I know you said earlier that health food stores, but don't people need to not think that all the stuff in the health food store is good for them? Because sometimes I think people go, and I'm also gluten-free, and I love the grain brain and the gluten-free and the sugar-free. All the books that you've written are amazing, but don't we just need to eat food that's just found in real nature?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to simplify it.
Yeah, so I would say, to answer your question, the answer is yes. We need to eat the things that people have messed with the least. And something that we've talked about in this book and in general is to avoid ultra-processed food. And to be fair, I am not somebody who wants to get into the nuances to every single dietary trend and talking about those pathways as much. As fascinating as something like mTOR is, I don't think that it's relevant for the average person who's just trying to make some dietary change to start improving his or her life. And so what we talk about as a general theme is lowering your intake of ultra-processed food. What does that mean? As it relates to carbohydrates, that means avoiding refined carbohydrates. It means avoiding added sugars. As it relates to fats, that means avoiding fats that have been processed by humans. Things like trans fats, things like a lot of these vegetable oils that aren't really in their natural state. And as it relates to proteins, we talk about trying to avoid certain types of animal products. Because if you think about how processing occurs, if you're an animal that's raised in a feedlot and you're being exposed to hormones, you're being exposed to antibiotics, you're being exposed to foods that you, as the animal, would never have eaten in your history of existence, and then that animal is processed and you eat it, you're basically getting the results of all of that ultra processing in that diet. So that's now going to be a more inflammatory meat product. So again, we've got to distill down the very complicated web of nutrition and dietary recommendations into something that the average person, again, the average person in the United States is overweight. The average person in the United States has a chronic disease. It's wonderful to talk about all these mechanisms, but most people would benefit from just having a basic idea of what to do when they go to the grocery store, whether that's the health food store or the standard grocery store. And again, just this is a much more a longer version of my answer to your question, which is eat the foods that people have messed with the least. If you can point out the ingredient and it's something like broccoli, it's something like an egg, you're much better off than you are trying to read through all those complex ingredients in the back of a box where you don't really know what's going on. The last thing I'd say to that is, if you are going to pick one specific intervention as it relates to avoiding processing of food, it's sugar. Sugar sweeteners are added to 68% of the foods that you're going to find in the grocery store, and that's drinks as well. We're having this addictive element that hijacks your brain circuitry added to the majority of the food and drink that we consume. And so if you're listening to this, I highly recommend, if you pick one thing, it's just start cutting out anything that has an added sweetener. If you look at the back of your food and drink and there's added sugar, that's something you don't want to be consuming.
What a great point. And it doesn't matter what form that is in. I mean, it's organic cane sugar or whatever. It's
exactly
sugar.
right.
Sugar. And, you know, another thing is, you know, people will latch on to one aspect of something they think is going to be good for them in terms of diet, like gluten-free. There are some deadly gluten-free foods out there. Just walk
They're
down
so
the
processed, right? Aren't they? I mean, processed foods.
Pardon me?
They're still a processed food then, right?
That's right. And, you know, we were the other day looking at in a coffee shop, and they had a whole counter in front of us of gluten-free cupcakes and
All the things.
All the things that look pretty tasty. But they're gluten-free, so therefore just go, I'll take a dozen. No, right. It doesn't work that way. We live in a time of recognizing what's called personalized medicine, the value of what's called personalized medicine. And I agree that, you know, to consider what might be good for an individual is really important. I think with all due respect, it's a bit elitist because globally, you know, the global population isn't in a place to generally take advantage of that technology. But we do know, as Austin made very clear, that there are the broad strokes. And I think the sugar issue is massive in terms of global health. And, you know, think about one thing, I'd say that sugar, and the other added sweeteners.
I think one other thing to that point is, again, we can get caught up in these traps or potentially productive conversations about exactly why a food is or isn't good for us. And we get into these mechanisms that I find personally fascinating, but then we wind up in a situation where you have these camps, whether that's vegan, carnivore, keto, paleo, and everyone's arguing against each other. And that is energy that is diverted from this central cause of improving health for the majority of people. It also makes it confusing for the average person to know what to do. And in that situation, in that absence of a coherent message, you get all the industry stuff that is so much easier to understand, which is, I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to eat, but this chocolate bar is good. And I don't know if I should be eating more or less wheat, so I'm just going to eat these cookies. And so our arguing over the nuances of what diet is perfect for the person means that for the average person, they won't know what to do. And in that kind of void of coherent information, the industry wins, and that person eats whatever is most readily available, and that's junk.
So the confused mind does nothing. Is there any final point that you want to leave our audience with about brainwash and how we can feel
I don't want to
better?
leave your audience just yet, actually.
What's that?
Brainwash makes a recommendation for one meal a day to be plant-based. And clearly, as we have learned, that is offensive to some people because it's as if we've sold out to the vegan mentality. And the point is, we are listening to those who think veganism is a good thing, just as we are listening to people who are talking to us about the value of sustainably raising beef. We're listening to the opinions of other people. And when we do that, we are participating in something called cognitive empathy. We're trying to see things from the perspective of other individuals, and that's valuable for everyone. It's certainly valuable for us. So when we experience pushback from the idea that there may be some value to going one meal a day plant-based, it seems as if it's not coming necessarily from a factual perspective, but more from an emotional perspective, that we've bailed on those people who really want us to be supportive of eating a lot of animals. Well, it isn't necessarily the best thing for our health, it seems, based on the science that we've reviewed, the most up-to-date science, to be pounding our systems with lots and lots of protein, and specifically animal protein. That it's not necessarily a good thing for our health to deprive ourselves of good sources of dietary fiber to nurture our gut bacteria. And we've come to an understanding that it probably makes sense from an environmental perspective that we opt for one meal a day to be plant-based. So we didn't come to this place from an emotional or an ideological frame of reference, but rather from looking at the science, which if people object to or want to confront us with, then we're delighted to have that discussion. Matter of fact, we're going to have a conversation with someone with an alternative view even later today that we will post. But that's what it's all about. Fundamentally, this is a great exercise for us and our viewers to recognize that it's really relevant and important and progressive to listen to the opinions of other people and embrace them and see how it feels to try that on, rather than digging in our heels and saying, my group says it's my way or the highway, end of story. And if you don't vote this way in the Senate or whatever, you're a bad person. You gotta be with other people's opinions. Again, that's called cognitive empathy. And that is lacking that, again, gets back to the disconnection syndrome that we talk about.
Well, thank you. I mean, you guys are such a wealth of information. I know we could go on, but I can't use up your whole day. But I know it's so wonderful that I didn't mean to gloss over your bio, Austin, that you actually are a doctor and you guys decided to come back and work together and face these crises head on. Is there anything else that you want our audience to know about you and where people can find both of you guys?
Well, so just a parting thought for the audience is, again, the world isn't set up for us to do well. And in order to be successful, whether that's with your health or with your mental health, you've got to start making some breaks with the status quo. And what we hope we're offering here for people with brainwash is the ability to start seeing through this mess, which is defined as the way things have to be. They don't have to be that way. And to start making changes to improve your life in a selfish way, but also in a way that you can relate to other people and connect with yourself and the planet, because that's maybe philosophy for me, but the best way of doing things. As far as where you can find us and find more information on the book website is originally named brainwashbook.com. And it's probably the best place to go and get the majority of the information you need. There's all the links to our social accounts and those types of things if that's interesting to you.
Absolutely. So brainwash.com. Thank you guys so much.
Brainwashbook.com.
Brainwashbook.com. Okay. And I'll have a link here for everybody to find you. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. We had a great time. This episode is brought to you by Good Pod.
Protein shakes are messy, expensive, and hard to make. Good Pod is a new amazing shake maker that's a blender and a pod in one. Take a pod, fill your glass with water or milk in 60 seconds or less. You have a healthy protein shake and it's ready to drink.